Hi, this is One God Ministry, and today we're talking about a very sensitive topic, and that is hell. But it is a topic that is so obscured by tradition that the true meaning has been lost in the Gospels. So, what comes to mind when we say the word hell? To some, it is a place located underneath the earth. It is also a place where Satan and the demons rule. Some people think it is a place of never ending fire and torment. It is a place where unsaved people are kept for eternity. And to other people and to most Christians, I believe, they believe hell is a mixture of all these elements. But is that so? The traditional concept of hell is based on pagan Greek and Roman ideas carried over to Christianity. So, the common Christians today actually have inherited the Greek and Roman ideas on hell and not really what the Bible is saying. We should try to understand what the scriptures reveal about hell. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of people cannot accept the truth in the Bible, particularly of that of the condemned state of mankind and of this world, and that there is only a few people who are actually going to be saved, and that the road to salvation is really narrow, it is because they are turned off by the word hell. But actually, I want to iron out what the real meaning of the word hell is. So the misunderstanding of what hell really is gives a type of phobia for people to read and understand the Bible. They have a hard time reconciling a God of love who would torture a person eternally for violating certain precepts while the latter was living his brief life on an imperfect fallen world. Even logic would tell you that it is hard for a God of love to really torture a certain person who has experienced, you know, the imperfect fallen world state. And so they are discouraged, actually, of believing in the Bible. When properly understood, the concept of hell would help us understand that our God is not assigning unsaved people on an endless existence of torture in a burning hell. I know that some Christians would not accept what I'm saying, but really, in the Bible, that is really what God really is. Okay? This study would show us that the righteous judgment of God of terminating in death those who are unworthy of eternal life. And that is the truth we are going to show in this series. Now, the key in here is this. The word hell mentioned in the English Bibles actually comes from three basic words that describe a place or state that are unique and different from each other. No matter what English Bible you use, actually, you will really have to go back to the original words that were used in the Bible. For example, in the Old Testament, the language was in Hebrew, and in the New Testament, it was in Greek. And the word hell is probably the most violated of all the translated words in the English Bibles because they didn't really properly translate the word itself. Let's look. The first place or state that is mentioned in the Bible is the grave, and that is sometimes translated as hell. And then there is the abyss, and again it is translated into the same word hell. The third is the lake of fire or the burning furnace, which comes close actually to eternal destruction description, and it is also translated as hell. But you notice that these three states or place actually are different from each other, and that is where the fault of the English Bibles are found, because they have mistranslated these three elements into one word, which is hell. And that shouldn't be so, because the original Bible was talking about three different things. So translators should have given separate names for these three states instead of giving them up to one word, hell. Mixing these three different states to a word hell, has caused enormous confusion in Christian theology. And this is what I will show you. First, let's look at the grave. It comes from the original Hebrew word Sheol in the Old Testament, and Hades, which is Greek in the New Testament. Now, let's look at the verses using Sheol in the Old Testament. It is found in Psalms 49 verse 15. But God will redeem my life from the grave, he will surely take to himself. So in here we see a correct translation of Sheol into the grave. Now let's look at Matthew 16:18. Jesus Christ said, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." Now the gates of Hades is sometimes translated as the gates of hell, like in the King James Bible. If one really understands that the Greek Hades simply means grave, then one can understand really the context of this verse. It does not mean that hell and the demons will never overcome the church, but rather what this verse is telling us is that the church will not die or go into extinction in the grave. So if you properly understand, researching the original words that was used, you will get a proper understanding of the context of the verses. Now let's look at Revelations 20 verse 14. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. So the translation of this verse becomes more complicated, because Hades in some verses of the New Testament are translated as hell, as we have seen in the earlier verse. And the lake of fire is also translated as hell. So in here, the lake of fire comes from the Greek word limne pur. It is symbolic of death and the grave being a thing in the past, meaning there is no more death in the new heavens and new earth. So if you are just going to take this as is, this verse, Revelation 20 verse 14, you will have a hard time reconciling it in the English translation. But if you actually understand the context of the original words that were used, you will understand properly really what is being talked about in here. Now let's look at the second word that is mistranslated as hell, and that is the abyss. In Greek, it comes from the Greek word abusos and also tartaro. Actually, it is a place of evil angels. It is also the bottomless pit. But if you understand it, it could even be dimension that is outside of this world. So it is something that the apostles and the writers of the Bible actually had a hard time explaining what it is. But right now, with the modern studies of the Bible and modern, let's say, translations of the Bible, we can see that this bottomless pit could really be a different dimension from the dimension that we are seeing today. Okay, that is why this abyss represents a prison of angels, and some people say that they can communicate with fallen angels by entering that particular dimension called the abyss. So let's look at the verses of the Bible. In 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4, it states, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell," which, if you look at the original word that was used, was tartaro, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment. In other words, it is basically a prison for fallen angels. In Luke 8, verse 30, we can read, Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged him repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. So what we see in here is actually a demoniac, a person possessed by demons. And the demons were said to be so numerous that their name was Legion, meaning probably 1,000 or 2,000 demons inside of a single person. And when Jesus was driving out the demons or fallen angels begged Jesus not to order them to go into the abyss. They didn't want to be imprisoned in the abyss, which is the dimension or the place of evil angels. Another thing we should notice in here is that the abyss already existed during Jesus' days. Unlike the lake of fire, also known as the burning furnace, which will exist at a future date, and this we will see in the other verses. So the abyss has already existed for thousands of years. Another verse using the abyss is in Revelation 20, verse 2. "And he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time." This excerpt comes from the book of Revelation, and it speaks actually of the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And in this 1,000-year millennial reign, Satan will not be allowed to tempt people on earth, but rather he will be locked up in the abyss. Okay, so the abyss will also exist in the future. Where Revelation 9, verse 11, "They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and in Greek Apollyon." Again, we notice in here that the abyss is a prison house for fallen angels. So the third word we're going to look at is actually Gehenna, which literally means the valley of Hinnom. For us to understand what Gehenna is, in ancient times, in the place of Jerusalem, near Jerusalem, there is a valley of Hinnom, and it is a place where they placed garbage, dead animals, and even dead people, such as criminals. And do you know what they did to those garbage, dead animals, dead people? They burned it in the valley of Hinnom. And that's why the Bible used Gehenna really to be symbolic of the lake of fire. And its synonyms are the fiery furnace and the burning furnace. In Matthew 10, verse 28, Jesus Christ said, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Fear him rather who can destroy both body and soul in hell." So the Greek word for destroy was apokteino, means annihilation or complete destruction. In here we see a scenario in which Jesus Christ describes that in Gehenna, both body and soul will be destroyed. Now this runs contrary to what is commonly believed in traditional Christianity, that the soul is immortal and that in hell, which is Gehenna actually in here, it is simply separated from God and is tortured. No, that is not what the Bible is saying. That is not what Jesus Christ is saying. This is absolute proof what Jesus Christ said, that both the body and soul will be thrown and destroyed in Gehenna. And this comes after the great white throne judgment, when those who will be judged by God as not worthy of receiving eternal life will be destroyed in Gehenna. Either we believe Jesus Christ when he said both body and soul will be destroyed in Gehenna, or you simply invent something that is contrary to what Jesus Christ is saying, and you are lying. Unfortunately, the majority of Christians, the majority of denominations actually are lying on this point. In Matthew 5, verse 22, we see in here, Jesus Christ is saying, "But I say this to you, anyone who is angry with a brother will answer for it before the court. Anyone who calls a brother fool will answer for it before the Sanhedrin. And anyone who calls him traitor will answer for it in the hellfire," which in the original language was Gehenna. So this shows us how deadly actually anyone will suffer when he doesn't control his mouth. And that could lead him to Gehenna. Okay, he will be thrown body and soul into Gehenna to be destroyed. Matthew 5:29 to 30. "It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell or Gehenna." Again, this is a warning from Jesus Christ that it is better for us to give up things in this life that will only lead us into eternal damnation or into Gehenna, or should I say eternal destruction. Matthew 13, verse 40 to 42. "As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin, and all who do evil. They will throw him into the fiery furnace, or purkaninos, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So what we see in here is a scenario wherein those, again, who are judged not worthy of eternal life will be thrown into the fiery furnace, which is also Gehenna, actually, if you study the context. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth because they will be thrown there alive and to be destroyed in Gehenna or Por Caminos. Okay? So it will exist at the end of the age. This verse clearly shows us it will come after judgment. So it does not exist today. In Hebrew 10:26 to 27, it states, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Probably this verse actually is one of the most misunderstood verses because some people simply do not accept the context of this verse because it would run contrary to what they believe in once saved, always saved. Actually, this verse tells us that even those people who received the knowledge of the truth, meaning they were formerly Christians, but kept on deliberately sinning, they will eventually also be thrown into the raging fire or zealous pur. Okay, so this is a warning that Gehenna will ultimately be the place of Christians who deliberately keep on sinning. And a lot of people want to hide this verse because of their traditional beliefs. Revelation 21, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters and all liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur, and this is the second death. Notice Jesus Christ calls it a second death, actually, because it is simply death. It is the destruction of body and soul. But other denomination and the majority of Christians still believe, oh, this is just a separation of the sinners to God. And they will be tormented in the burning furnace or the lake of burning sulfur. And that is really out of context. If the Bible calls it a second death, we should accept it as a second death. Death is simply extinction or destruction. So another question would arise, where will Gehenna be located? Is it below the earth? Is it somewhere in space? Or where is it? In 2 Peter 3:7, it states, by the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. So the lake of fire, the fiery furnace, actually will be on earth someday. The earth itself will actually be burned. Okay? And the heavens being mentioned in here is actually the first heaven, which is the atmosphere right above the earth, where the birds and airplanes fly. So the earth refers in here to the surface of the land. We don't know what part of the earth will be burned, but what we do know is that it is not below the earth, but rather it is the surface of the earth itself and even the first heavens. So another question we want to answer is, when will Gehenna exist? And again, let us let the Bible speak. In Malachi chapter 4 verse 1 and 3, surely the day is coming, it will burn like a furnace. Again, that word, furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble, and that day that is coming will set them on fire. says the Lord Almighty. Not a root or a branch will be left to them. Then you will trample down the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I do these things, says the Lord Almighty. Either we believe the Bible or we do not believe the Bible. Gehenna is actually going to exist in the future, and it will be the burning of the earth itself. And what will also be burned on that day will be the wicked. And it says in here, when God is finished burning the wicked, destroying body and soul, there will not really be a root or a branch that will left of them. But traditional Christianity will tell us, oh, they are still living, they will still be living in hell forever and being tortured. That is not so. Either Malachi is correct or not. The Bible is correct or not. If you believe in the Bible, then you should believe that the wicked will someday be ashes under the soles of your feet. They will be burned like Sodom and Gomorrah and turned into ashes. So the furnace does not exist today and is to exist actually in the future, as the earlier verses have mentioned. There is no burning hell today. Okay? It will be in the future. So what is meant by eternal fire? Is it fire that will never die out, meaning men who are supposed to be immortal will be roasted and tortured for eternity? Incidentally, to understand whether men are immortal or not, just look at the video we have prepared on body, soul, and spirit. So we look at Jude 7 to answer this question. I quote, "In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They served as an example of those who suffered the punishment of eternal fire, Aionos Pur." So to understand eternal fire, Jude 7 tells us we have to look at Sodom and Gomorrah today, as the Bible states that what these cities suffered are examples of eternal fire. But some people will argue, oh, eternal fire is fire that will burn for eternity. Is that really so? So let us let the Bible explain. Let us let Jude 7 explain. Again, either you believe the Bible, you believe Jude 7, or you do not believe the Bible and tell the Bible is a liar. So I prepared several pages to show you what Sodom and Gomorrah looks like today. They are found in the vicinity of the Dead Sea, in areas occupied by Israel and Jordan. In here we can see a huge, what you might say, huge mansion that used to be made up of limestone but was burned into calcium ashes by God by raining down sulfur, as the Bible states. And this is part of Sodom. And here we see several structures. Some look like mansions, still with their roofs within them. And there are huge walls. And this is still found in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. You can see how big the mansions of Sodom and Gomorrah before were. And they were burned into ashes, but still retain their original shape. But if you go in there today, in what used to be Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, you can poke your finger into these calcium ashes and it will simply crush. The main reason why this has been preserved as in their original shapes actually is because of very little rainfall in this area, because the land has now been totally cursed by God. And this very little rainfall actually has helped preserve the shapes of these calcium ashes. Again, we can see clearly this house, even with its pillars, and it has been burned completely. Now, some may argue, oh, those are just natural features of the landscape. No, that's impossible, because these structures really retain their original shapes. By the way, if you look into this area, you can still see some of the sulfur that were thrown down by God from heaven into Sodom and Gomorrah, because some of them didn't hit places where they are to consume something. Meaning, you can go there in the vicinity of the Dead Sea and still see these balls of sulfur. And according to some of those who investigated, such as Ron Wyatt, you can go to his site. These balls of sulfur are made almost completely of pure sulfur that is not found anywhere on earth. Again, you can see the city walls of these cities, and they were burned into ashes, but they still retained their original shapes. Again, we see in here, and we see on the side a tall structure, and this structure also resembles some type of a ziggurat or a pyramid which was burned. So we notice the following on the features of Sodom and Gomorrah. The eternal fire the cities suffered burned the cities completely, burning everything, even limestone, turning even the limestone, which is calcium carbonate, to calcium ash or calcium sulfate. So if you look at the chemical equation of what happened, calcium carbonate was burned by pure sulfur. That's why it turned into calcium ash, and the carbonate escaping as actually as gas. So once what could be burned, which was practically everything, were burned completely, and the eternal fire ceased. Now this is very important. So eternal fire is not fire that goes on burning forever. Rather, it is fire which will not stop burning until what is to be burned has been burned completely. We see in here the true meaning of eternal fire. It is a fire that will burn completely, as we said, and then eventually the fire ceases. We notice also that all praises of people have also been burned to ash. And this is what we expect from Gehenna fire, as was stated by Malachi, we cited earlier. So again, we invite you to look at our video of One God Ministries on the body, soul, and spirit. So how can we be sure that the end of the wicked is a literal second death or eternal destruction? In Matthew 10, Jesus Christ said, as we have seen earlier, that we should fear Him rather who is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna hell. Either you believe Jesus Christ or call Him a liar. That is, you do not believe that the body and the soul will be destroyed in Gehenna. Revelations 2 verse 10, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. So, second death is simply the eternal destruction being talked about in the Bible. And it is a literal second death. Either you believe in the Bible or you would say the Bible is a liar. But the second death is not metaphoric, it is literal. Then again, in Revelation 20, verse 14, then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire, and this is the second death. So the lake of fire represents the second death, and it is a literal death, not a metaphoric separation of man, from God. Revelations 20, verse 8, the cowardly, the unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Again, we see it is literal. What about the parable of Lazarus and the rich man? Isn't it proof that hell is a place of conscious torture? It is found in Luke 16, and you can read the whole passage as an assignment. I called in hell, where he was in torment. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. Okay, so this text is frequently used by Bible teachers to teach us that at death, the soul immediately goes to heaven or hell without passing to the great white throne judgment. And this actually is inconsistent. Okay? Because the Gehenna hell is to exist after the millennial reign of Christ, and the great white throne judgment is still to exist after that. Okay, so if we accept the parable of Lazarus and the rich man as literal and not a parable, we would run into a lot of problems. We would say that's why some people would say that the Bible is inconsistent, simply because certain portions of it are misunderstood. And the parable of Lazarus and the rich man is probably the most misunderstood of all the parables of Jesus. So we encourage you to go into our video on parable of Lazarus and the rich man, in which we will explain the specific items that were mentioned in here. Actually, the parable cannot be used as an example of what occurs upon death and what transpires in death, or rather in Hades, as it is actually symbolic. So we have to understand the symbolic context of the parable to understand it correctly. First thing you have to consider is that there is no discussion of the sins of the rich man that brought him into punishment. There is no discussion of how Lazarus earned reward in the afterlife, and the reward was simply being in the bosom of Abraham and not eternal death. In the original text, the bosom of Abraham actually means the breast of Abraham. Is that really what heaven is, being in the breast of Abraham? So let's try to understand the symbolic meaning of this parable. The rich man, represented by the Jews, actually, as they were rich in the knowledge about God and also rich in spiritual blessings, of the children of Abraham. Meaning, they were supposed to be the people who were to be in the bosom or the breast of Abraham. Because what you put in your breast are actually your children. And the Jews were actually the children of Abraham. Romans 9:4-5 states regarding the Jews, the people of Israel, theirs is the adoption as sons, theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of Jesus, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen. So, this text describes actually how Jews are literally the sons of Abraham and the blessings they have and the richness they have. The poor man Lazarus was actually a metaphor or symbolic for the Gentiles who really didn't know God, who were poor in their knowledge of God and poor also in spiritual blessings as they were not biological children of Abraham. But eventually, notice that Lazarus was placed in the bosom of Abraham, meaning that, that Lazarus became a child of Abraham. So the parable and prophecy speaks of a future time in the new covenant when the spiritual blessings will fall more on the Gentiles because they will be more willing to accept the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. And the majority of Jews would fall into the grave, and those who would persist in the old covenant would fall into the grave. The Gentiles will eventually become the grafted children of Abraham. So this is the reason why Lazarus was found eventually in the bosom of Abraham. Okay? I hope that clears up a lot of misunderstanding. So now let's look at the salient points on Gehenna, lake of fire, or the fiery furnace. The fiery furnace will exist at the end of the age. Those that cause sin and all who do evil will be thrown into the fiery furnace. Sodom and Gomorrah serve as an example of those who suffered the punishment of eternal fire. Its inhabitants were burned to death, so they are not kept alive and tortured in flames. The fire came from heaven and burned the surface of the land. This is an example of how the eternal fire or hell will be formed. Supernatural fire will come from heaven and burn a specific surface of the earth. Sodom and Gomorrah were consumed completely until the city became ashes, and this is what is meant by eternal fire. Sodom and Gomorrah are not burning today anymore because the eternal fire has stopped burning once the elements have been burned. People burned by the eternal fire will die the second death. Their bodies and soul, as Jesus Christ said, will be destroyed, and they will be burned until they become ashes and salt. So destroy both body and soul in Gehenna means literal annihilation or complete destruction even of soul. And that does not mean a mere separation from God. The lake of fire will be a place to die. That is why it is called the second death. The lake of fire is described as the second death and not a place of everlasting torture to an immortal being. When the wicked are set on fire, it will consume them completely until they become ashes under the soles of your feet. The eternal fire and fiery furnace will occur on the present heavens and earth itself. The heavens or atmosphere above the earth will also be burned. The present heavens and earth will be burned after the great white throne judgment. We should respect the time sequence the Bible describes and not create our own time sequence. That is why a lot of people are so confused with the word hell. The spirits of those awaiting judgment are kept by God in a temporary place until the great white throne judgment, wherein they will be resurrected. They are not in the lake of fire right now, meaning the lake of fire does not exist right now. All who are not translated will have to face the great white throne judgment. Okay, so I hope this clears up a lot of issues concerning hell, that we should understand that the original words used were the grave, actually the abyss, and Gehenna. I hope with this study will clear up your mind and free yourselves of the lies that have been perpetuated by traditional Christianity and all the confusion that have led all the confused Christians, even pastors, church elders, denominations. I hope they would all have their minds cleared up by letting simply the Bible speak. So I thank you for giving your time, and may God bless you.